Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webcast and live stream. Pathways to International Hiring Success, How to Find and Hire Top Talent in Any Country. This webcast has been pre-approved for HRCI and SHRM credit. If you're watching this webcast via live stream on any of our social channels, you need to view the archive recording on HR.com to receive your credit. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to GoGlobal for their presentation.
Hello, welcome everybody. I am Andrew Lindquist, a partner with GoGlobal. Just a little bit of background on myself. I spent approximately 13 years in various management roles and managed teams from Beijing to Paris. And then the second half of my career, I've really helped companies expand and operate overseas. I'm really looking forward to an interactive discussion here today with my partner, Nick Broughton.
Thank you, Andrew. Ditto, echoing your remarks there. Very happy to hear we are live streaming all over the internet and socials. That's really exciting. And delighted to be working with HR.com on this webinar as well. So my background is actually slightly different from Andrew's. I'm from originally the recruitment background, executive search. I moved after about 14 years of recruitment into the UK payroll space, meandered through into the global employment outsourcing, and then led me into the EOR space with GoGlobal now. So about 17 years of experience, and I kind of live and breathe remote work, remote recruitment, and very excited to be here. I will note that myself and Andrew have particularly different backgrounds. We don't always agree on everything, and the purpose of this session is to inform, educate, give opinion. This is a grey space. There's no right, there's no wrong. We just want to open the floor and give lots of information. We encourage you to utilize the chat. We have someone monitoring the chat. We will cover any of the questions at the end of the session as well. I have my colleague Martha in the background there. So we're looking forward to a good session. So let's move on.
So we'll start off with a poll question right away. So how is the current market uncertainty impacting your expansion plans? And I think, what we've all seen is that there's been some slowdown. It's impacted different sectors. So for you, is it, impacting not at all? Are you slowing down plans, or are things coming to a full stop? Really curious to see how that's impacting different companies, and especially where you are in sort of your growth journey.
Results are in.
And so far, I think that's indicative of what we're seeing in the market as well. There are some sectors and some companies that see this as, no change, and, maybe even opportunity. There's certainly more talent available in some sectors, right? If you're looking at hiring software engineers and things like that, and you're a growing company, there's more choice, more opportunity than ever before. And then certainly there are companies that we're seeing that are scaling back and looking to see how things evolve over the next, 6 months in terms of their hiring plans.
So no one has said we're putting a full stop on plans, which is good news, because there's plenty of opportunities. So yeah, very indicative of what we're seeing in the market for sure. Thank you for your participation. Straight off the bat, we can move on.
So who is GoGlobal? I think, first of all, we're an employer of record service provider. We are one of the fastest growing in this space. So we've just entered our 60th country, and we'll be out with a press release on that very soon. We're really excited about that. We started in Asia Pacific and then grew through Europe, the Americas, and our most recent expansion is right now in Africa and the Middle East. That's where we're seeing a lot of opportunity, and really where we're looking to expand. So just some facts and figures here. So 50 nationalities. I think that's really important to GoGlobal's success. In those 60 countries that we operate in, most of them are staffed with local nationals that understand the HR complexities and also the cultural nuances of employing people in those countries. We do work outside of our 60 offices, so we do have partnerships throughout the world. So we can and are supporting clients in 110 plus countries. One of the joys of being in this business is if you're operating in this many countries, there are tons of regulatory changes that deal with compliance from an employment standpoint. So we're processing, updating, and keeping our clients and our workers aware of those changes throughout the course of the year, practically on a daily basis. Our team has grown pretty rapidly. So I started a few years ago, we were at 38 workers. We're now at 220 GoGlobal employees. Most of our workers are highly skilled. The average salary is around $80,000. Our average tenure for our workers is 18 to 24 months. And that's because many workers are with us as an interim sort of to a company setting up or on a sort of term contract basis. So that's pretty typical in this space. 2,500 workers worldwide. And I think this is a good sort of snapshot of some of the statistics. Anything you want to add here, Nick?
No, I just think it's important to distinguish between the internal staff and the staff we manage. So we're now working with, I believe, as of last week, about 500 different clients, of which across those clients, we're managing 2,500 employees, literally all over the world. So really exciting space to be in. And as Andrew mentioned, most of the staff we're dealing with are highly skilled, white collar, across the tech, sales, go-to-market roles, of which we've seen certainly a big boom in the last few years.
So I think you've probably already heard us banter some names, some acronyms, employer of record, otherwise called EOR. It's essentially a means and a model to hire internationally, to hire local talent. The most typical use case is when you don't have a legal entity in country. So I'm going to pause here for a second. Sometimes our model is referred to as international PEO. There is a slight nuance in that. So PEO is utilized here in the States. Very common to employ workers through a PEO service. Essentially, in order to have a PEO in the US, you need to have a legal entity. And again, our model is really for companies that are hiring overseas that typically don't have a presence in that country. And so we use our legal structure to hire those workers and essentially become an extension of our client's HR team. So we take care of all the employment compliance, all the payroll related compliance, and then the client manages the workers sort of on a day-to-day basis as if they were their own employee. Anything you want to add to that, Nick?
No, you got it.
Okay, yeah. I think that's the one thing, that I often point out, because I think a lot of folks in the space call it a PEO, and I know it's a nuance, but it's actually an employer of record. And so there are some slight differences to that.
Yeah, I think it's just the difference between the co-employment PEO model versus EOR, which is a slightly different approach, whereby we take care of all administrational, payroll, tax, benefits, and the client instructs the work on a day-to-day basis.
Yes, I mean, a lot of the the benefits are the same, right? I mean, you're getting that HR expertise and sort of outsourced HR. There's a certain amount of pooling of benefits, and obviously the compliant aspects are all common to both. It's just in order to operate what is truly a PEO, you should have, or you will need to have, an entity in country. So a few just overarching trends. One, the market has grown significantly. So you can see some numbers here by the research firm Evaluates, where we've seen sort of a compound annual growth rate of 6.9%. And we see that sort of continuing through 2028. The estimates here are, in the billions of dollars. with that being, almost $7 billion by the year 2028. I actually reckon that the market's bigger than this. I think it may be underestimating sort of the growth in the last couple of years. I think, one of the interesting things that happened, obviously there was nothing, good that came out of the global pandemic, but I think, one of the trends that emerged was, getting used to managing a remote workforce. And so as a result of that, I think companies began to look at their hiring model and saw that as an opportunity to hire sort of where the talent is, to hire in new markets, and use a model like an EOR to do so nimbly without having the burden of your own sort of heavy footprint. And so I think companies have adopted this strategy to grow quicker, and also just bring in the best talent, no matter where that talent is. Again, not being confined by zip code of where your headquarters are or where your engineers typically would have been hired. Some of the other things, just in terms of trends, as I just mentioned, sort of access to highly skilled and affordable talent pools, right? So, particularly in high tech and other sort of technically skilled positions, there's a shortage of talent in places like the US in many cases. And so where are the alternatives to find that talent? And we're finding some of these emerging hotspots all over the globe. And a model like an employer of record sort of gives you the ability to go in and quickly hire those talents at a very competitive local salary and remuneration that would be, in many cases, less than what you would pay in your local market. I think another thing that, especially, one of the trends in the last couple of years that have emerged in our space is utilizing our model when it comes to M&A. So particularly on asset deals or carve-out deals where you may be buying the assets of a company, but not maybe the legal structure that houses some of those employees. And so we can come in and stand those workers up. Sometimes they're called orphaned employees. We're actually going to take a deeper dive on this March 21st on another session, but it is something that we're seeing a lot of. The other thing that comes into play in terms of M&A is, what we're seeing in terms of diligence. Companies either on the sell side, sort of preparing for sale, or companies on the buy side looking at the opportunities in the market and doing their diligence are looking at the worker population overall, and they're looking to see if there are possible red flags in terms of a large population that may be misclassified, particularly, independent contractors that are misclassified. And so that can come up, not just in M&A, it can come up in, IPO readiness. It can come up in major transactions, so a fundraising round. If, a lot of companies at a very early stage, they grow really quick. They don't necessarily, they're not looking at the further on impact of making some of those hires. So we're coming in and being able to stand up some of those workers that may be misclassified and employ them through our model, either as a long-term solution or sometimes as a bridge solution while they're setting up an entity. And that helps, lessen the risk to the potential buyer. So again, we see that on the sell side and the buy side of deals. And I think, you go ahead, Nick.
I was going to say, I think one of the things I've noticed, because I joined the industry about 8 years ago, I was wondering what you're thinking about this, is just the general awareness. Firstly, the awareness of the products and the use cases and the actual applications for EOR. When I first joined the market 8 years ago, there was really only test a new market, hire a salesperson. It was always hire a salesperson in Europe to test the market. But now, as you pointed to, there are a multitude of use cases, and we'll go through some of those later. But it's definitely, from an awareness and adoption perspective, changed dramatically in the last 3 years. The EOR acronym, the options for clients. So that's what I've noticed most, and that's what is exciting.
I think there's some other trends that aren't up here too that we see. So the example of Nick just indicating in terms of hiring sales in a more mature market like Europe. And maybe 4 or 5 years ago, you might hire tech talent in India or places in Southeast Asia. But actually, companies are recognizing that these are actually huge markets to sell their service and products into. And so we're seeing a lot of sales hires in developing economies and emerging economies, much more so than we have in years past. So, hiring salespeople to cover Latin America, hiring salespeople to cover parts of Southeast Asia and bigger markets like India as well. And then I think, one of the things that GoGlobal does a lot of is we work with a lot of business process outsourcing companies that help stand up entities. And so, they do sort of the more traditional expansion. And so they're processing payroll and, they're creating entities on behalf of their clients. But in a lot of cases, clients have an immediate need. Maybe there's somebody, a rock star that they want to hire, sort of as soon as possible. Or they're looking to ramp up really quickly in a country and they have certain targets that they need to meet. And setting up an entity can take time. I mean, in some countries, you can set up a legal entity in the click of a button, but to actually stand it up and make it operational takes more time. There's complications when you're, setting up bank accounts and things like that. So we're a bridge solution for a lot of those scenarios, right? And one of the bigger projects that I worked on last year was well-known media company was looking to set up in India. They were hiring a bunch of software engineers in India, and it was going to take them the better part of 6 months. And at the end, it took them almost 12 months. And in that sort of interim period, we hired 50 people as a bridge solution. So we're going to go through some of the models. One of the things I always say, the models don't really compete. They augment, they complement each other. And sometimes you can employ all three models at the same time in different markets, or sometimes even in the same market. So there isn't a one size fits all.
Okay, on to the next poll question. Break things up. Let's get some participation. So how many countries outside of the US, which is predominantly where our audience are today, does your company currently operate in? So more than 50 countries you operate in, more than 20, more than 5, or none. Very interesting to get some takes on where you all are. Yeah,
there probably should have been a choice for 1 to 5. If you want to add some chat or comments in the chat, please do. I think a lot of the traditional expansion still follows a similar sort of course today, especially if you're a software company. And I know, our client base is pretty diverse, but I think, it's very common for software companies to expand quickly. They sort of follow, sort of easiest market entry, where laws are similar, languages are similar. So I think a lot of companies still look to the UK and Australia and Singapore as sort of a first port of entry when expanding overseas, and then sort of look at other places after that, whether it be shared service centers in another country, or sales in a more complex market like in Japan, or some of the Western European economies.
Okay, well, we've got some results and quite interesting. So quite a large percentage of the audience are in no countries outside the US. So the next question will be interesting. And then we have a small population with more than 50. So it looks like we've got a real wide spread of participants who are operating globally. So I think we can jump to the third poll, because it really bridges this one. So we can jump to the third poll. So just moving on from the second poll, what are your top target regions for expansion? For those of you that are looking outside of your current borders or current operational presence. So LATAM, Americas. Now we've conflated Europe and Middle East, which is probably not the best thing to do because they're very distinct and we're seeing big trends in both. So anyone that's operating or looking to operate in Europe, Middle East, please add to the chat because that's interesting as well. Asia, Africa, or other. So let's give it a bit of time to go through.
Yeah, maybe I'll just interject here. And I mentioned it earlier. I think we're seeing Africa as a major opportunity for growth for GoGlobal. We have a lot of our IT hires in Africa now, sort of internal support. But we're also, I think traditionally, and we still see this, right, NGOs in Africa. But one of the trends, and Nick is going to dive into this, is sort of nearshoring talent. And one of the trends is for European countries with companies headquartered there is to nearshore talent in Africa. Doesn't show prominently on our poll. But Latin America is certainly another growing market for us. And that same trend that I was mentioning in Europe applies to a lot of American companies that are looking to sort of nearshore talent, especially tech talent, in places like Colombia and Mexico.
Yeah, no, there's some interesting comments in the chat. I mean, Europe is always going to remain, a hot market for US companies, and Latin America, and we'll talk about it later. You could call nearshoring is another trend that we're seeing certainly spike in the last 18 months, hiring, sales, go-to-market talent, whether that be sales, customer services, marketeers in time zones, helpful time zones to your current headquarters. So some really good stuff we can dive into later. Andrew, back to you.
Great. So at this point, I think we're going to look at, some of the reasons why, companies hire internationally. And then we're going to take a more detailed look at the vehicles to do that. So what are the means to hire people in different countries? And look at, some of the considerations for each of those models. And again, I think the one thing I want to, reiterate is it's not sort of, one model for all or any particular situation. I think you can use different means throughout your sort of expansion process to hire folks. And we'll dive into the details here a little bit. So I think one of the first things is kind of the why of international expansion. So, first and foremost, is there new revenue potential? So, have we seen competitors, be successful in a market? Are we getting active interest from, other countries that we haven't actively been selling to, but maybe have reached out to us through, web leads? I think that is a very typical reason to expand, a very obvious reason to expand. There are a lot of potential pitfalls in expanding into a new market, and we'll go through some of those as well. Operational cost reduction. So can I produce something, more efficiently, more cost effectively in another market that I'm not already in? And so, outsource manufacturing, for example, I think traditionally you'd look at places, especially sort of in hardware, like China, which has got a very high skill, labor force, and a lot of what I'll call just, I think one of the challenges for a lot of companies today, especially in the hardware sector, is if you're relying on an outsourced manufacturing model. China is still one of the only places where you can really have a turnkey solution almost instantaneously. There's that much expertise. Now that's changing, and I think people are looking at that. Obviously, there's some geopolitical trends as well, sort of impacting this. But places like Vietnam, other places in Southeast Asia, which may have been more predominantly, I'll call sort of low tech centers of production. The workforce has changed dramatically over the course of the last 10 years. Part of that has been demand-based. Part of that is just, greater educational means in these countries. And I think also because it's been a trend now for a number of years, there's just a buildup of expertise in more countries now. So there's an opportunity to reduce spend and look at new markets to do that. Another sort of thing is along those lines, and I have to move my little chat bubble here so I can see it. The business and supply chain diversification. I'll also say, maybe even looking at distribution models. So where do I get the components that go into my widget? And can I change where I'm purchasing those, or should I be exploring different options? Or how do I manage if I'm not in a country, and I don't have a big presence? How can I manage my distribution and my supply chain partners? And so the employer of record model may be a means to do that. Good example of this is we work with a large alcohol beverage company. And one of the biggest markets is in Asia Pacific. They don't have much of a presence in terms of their own legal entity structure, and they've been reliant and successful in their sales through distribution partners. However, what they found is it made a lot of sense to have boots on the ground to manage those distributors. So they use the employer of record model to do that. Along the sort of sales, growing sales, organic growth opportunities. And what does that mean? It means that you've had partners or you've had existing clients that are now in new countries, and they're kind of pulling you with them. So that's something that we see quite a bit. A lot of the sort of applications that are tied to Salesforce, to Microsoft, to other sort of larger scale systems, they're being pulled across into new markets because those products and services are growing in new markets. And so there is a demand for sort of the supplementary applications that support those larger applications. So that's quite common. And then, a big thing is you have customers, depending on where you are in your growth cycle, you have customers, you have partners that are very diverse and coming from a number of different countries. And so the benefits of expanding is actually having boots on the ground that understand, can market to those groups more effectively. You have more touch with your clients, your customers, and your partners. And so, I think the same for any domestic company, the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion can really also be achieved by looking at how you have a wider international footprint and getting those different inputs and different factors to improve your product and your service. And then Nick will do a deep dive, but I think obviously a huge reason to go international is hiring new talent and finding niche talent, and sometimes scarce job markets, especially domestic markets where you've found that it's really hard to find certain talent at a cost that makes sense for the business. Nick, you want to jump in here? I know I covered a lot of ground, but anything that you want to expand on or dive into?
Sure. I think the DE&I piece is very interesting. Something I've written some articles about. You touched on the ability to create a more rich environment, cultural environment, engage with workers literally all around the world, across the full spectrum. That's certainly added a lot of value to my personal experience in our company and previous companies. So I think that's something to note. And we will go into more detail on the talent side, and from testing new products and services or pushing existing products and services. Again, the spread of clients that we're seeing, that we have seen adopt all different models of either setting up in country or utilizing the EOR model. An example just came up the other week. It's interesting, working with a fast-growing makeup brand, and they were looking for talent outside of the UK. They have a very, very, very successful product, hiring local cultural savvy, local speakers in Europe to push that via Instagram. That's made a dramatic impact on their business, their bottom line. They're already capturing revenue in month one. So it just goes to show how quickly you can enter a new market. This is we're talking 7 days from getting someone on the ground to pushing a product to speaking to customers in their local language. So this is a game changer. We didn't see this stuff 8 years ago. There was other ways and means, and we'll touch upon that again, but it's just another example of how companies can take advantage of what's out there and benefit them. So I think we can move on to the next page.
So some of the considerations just to think about, I know for a lot of folks on this call, given the previous poll questions, you've gone through this process already, but really simple, how much is it going to cost to enter the market? And there are the obvious costs, right? And again, this is going to depend on your model, and we'll dive into what those options are. But there are the sunk costs. So what kind of capital am I going to need to open up in a country? And what are the costs of maintaining if you're setting up an entity? So the compliance, right? The accounting, the external sort of compliance costs, obviously the cost of employment, right? Different countries have vastly different employer contributions. So a salary may be low in a country, but the employer contributions may be very, very high. That may offset some of the savings that you would have in a lower, salary in a country. Those are questions that we get all the time. I think the other thing that maybe companies don't think about sometimes are the internal cost or the opportunity costs of expanding into a new market. So you have things like, who's going to manage the HR for these workers? Do we have that internal expertise? Are we going to have to go out and find a third party to help us with that? There are, HR advisory firms out there. Sometimes your international payroll operator may offer some sort of support on that, but oftentimes it's very difficult to find kind of the right cost model to do that, especially if you don't have a large footprint in a particular country and you can't have your own dedicated HR resource. So having the right talent, that the time spent in things like consolidating financials, it sounds like a very small thing, but we have to figure out how to do this within our ERP. There's going to be a cost of setting that up, and then monthly sort of time spent by the accounting team. And does the accounting team have that sort of level of international experience, right? And do I need to go out and find additional resources as I go into more countries? The legal and regulatory environment is really important, and this, covers a wide variety of things. I think just from a corporate governance perspective, what do I need in order to set up? What are my ongoing obligations? Are there legal ramifications to my CEO, CFO if I enter this country, with a certain model? Those are some of the questions that you really should be thinking about as you're entering. If you're looking at, not setting up your own entity, what are the risks of permanent establishment in a country? And so what I mean by that, and this is a question that we get all the time, is, okay, if I hire an independent contractor or if I use an employer of record solution, is there a risk that, I could be deemed to have a taxable presence in that country? And there are certainly tax experts that can help you answer some of those questions. From a GoGlobal perspective, there's a number of things that we can help do to mitigate that risk. If you're going to have a direct revenue model, so you're going to generate sales invoices from a country, EOR won't be a solution for you in most cases. But there are sort of means to limit or mitigate permanent establishment risk if you're not choosing that model. Then, tax ramifications. So not just the permanent establishment risk, but what sort of tax model am I going to have? Is it going to be a cost plus model? Is it going to be that direct revenue model? It doesn't make sense to have a holding company, especially, and there were a few folks on this call that have, 50 plus countries that they work in. I imagine that they've done a fair amount of tax planning as to, the holding entities and to mitigate sort of some of the tax cost, right? Some of these are product based, right? So needless to say, just understanding what the local competition is, what the local ecosystem is, right? In some countries, Japan being a great example of that, having been there for 6 years, being tied to a distributor or to a larger organization will help open up so many doors for you. And so understanding that sort of dynamic before you get there or before you invest too much time and money into a market is obviously advisable, but you would be surprised at the number of companies that sort of don't take that route. I spent a good portion of my career helping a lot of companies set up their legal entities in Japan. It's a great market if you know it well and you understand it and your product sort of fits into that market. But I've seen a lot of companies not do their homework, not adapt to the local market, and sort of fall flat on their face and are out almost as soon as they were in. And along those lines, localizing products, like I said earlier, a lot of companies when they first start expanding, they're expanding into English-speaking countries if that's where they're headquartered. But if you're going into more complex markets, you have to think about, how you're marketing in those, what your interface looks like. And there's a good deal of money and time that needs to go into that before you sort of open up those doors. Failure to localize the HR strategy. So this is a tough one for companies of all sizes. I think the big thing here is, your policies in your headquarter country may not fit the legislation and customs in every country that you operate in. And so finding kind of what's fair and equal to your global workforce is, I think, the best sort of consideration. You may have, better, pension plans in one country, better leave plans in another country. How do I make this, how do I create a sort of global policy that is sort of fair and equal to my global base? And also, I think the biggest mistake that a lot of companies make when they enter a new market when it comes to HR is particularly for US companies is, outside of the US, there are very few countries that are employment at will. And so while it may be easier to hire somebody in another country, it's not always as easy to terminate that worker. And so you have to make those considerations, especially if you're looking at sort of a much larger headcount population in a given country. Nick, anything you want to add here? I do a lot of talking. This is pretty common for me, guys. So Nick, jump in anytime you want.
No, I'm enjoying, for the purpose of time, we're going to skip on to some other topics as well. But I think the cultural nuances when companies expand is not to be underestimated. After all, our business is built around entering new markets ourselves, right? And we've made mistakes. We understand by not being fully prepared, not understanding the local nuances, the customs, the regimes, the language. So hiring people in country, not trying to manage that operation from far abroad with little boots on the ground can make a dramatic difference to your immediate success, whether you're bringing people in to manage an entity or whether you're doing that via an EOR model. So certainly something that we've learned ourselves from, and hopefully we can pass that off to this audience as well. So but I think for the purpose of time, we'll kick on to some other topics as well.
Correct. So just quickly, the evolution of expansion. I think we touched on a lot of these, and this is a little bit of a repeat, but the sort of three core areas where we see companies, utilizing global expansion is to generate new business and new markets, to diversify supply chain and their vendor footprint, and then tap into top talent. We'll take a little deeper dive into tapping into talent and some of the trends in terms of hiring in different markets. So maybe we can just sort of proceed because I am sort of conscious of time here. Legacy model of doing international business was very much, hey, we're going to set up a domestic business. That footprint grows, and at some point in time, the decision is made to take the product or service into a market overseas. And look, there are still a lot of companies that follow that same path today. It's not entirely changed, but I think what we see now and sort of the evolution is hiring overseas can happen at any stage of a sort of business's life cycle. A great example of this, working with a company that's in a very hot tech sector right now. Lots of chat about AI and things that are happening in that space. This company is very shortly going to go into a fundraising round, but they're basically in their very inception. First hire that they've made, I'm lucky enough to have some connectivity to the founder, and the very first hire that they're making is in Australia, and he's going to be the key sort of architect. And so again, before cent one comes into the business or there's been any sort of revenue, the first hire is going to be international. And so the risks are still there in all of these countries when you're operating. And I think kind of there's a beauty in that, right? It allows you to just move really, really quickly. I think the risk in that is I think a more mature company is going to develop some bench of expertise when it comes to international and have a lot of that sort of know-how in-house. But if you're doing this from a very early stage, the chances are is you don't have that sort of depth of experience or the breadth of experience in operating in multiple countries. And so you run into some challenges really early on. And we'll touch on some of those. Real quickly, I'm going to go through some of the vehicles to hire internationally. And these are what I'll call sort of organic growth, right? There's always an opportunity to buy assets or merge or buy companies to increase your footprint. But these are the organic methods. The first is permanent establishment. So that's typically setting up a subsidiary or branch. The second is in-country rep offices. So some countries around the world will let you kind of have this kind of small footprint, which is often limits the type of business activities that you can undertake. There are also, particularly in Europe, what's called non-registered entities or non-registered employers. And essentially what that is it's just a payroll registration. So it allows you to do the compliance of a local company and hire compliantly. There are, some risks that come with that, and we can touch upon that a little bit later, but that is a means in some countries to make hires. Independent contractors. So, obviously we see a lot of that. There's businesses that have been built out to support independent contractors as a standalone business. And then the last is the employer of record, which I've already mentioned is sort of the legal vehicle to hire. A company like GoGlobal becomes an extension of your HR team. So it means you don't necessarily have to have the legal footprint in country to hire. So those are the four sort of main categories when you're hiring internationally from an organic standpoint. And we've touched on a lot of these in terms of use cases. So testing a product, piloting a product, maybe using EOR as a means to prepare for a transaction. So as I mentioned, misclassified employees, correcting that using an employer of record is one of the areas that we see in terms of use cases. The bridge solution. So, the example that I gave in India was a really good one where we were working with a software company and they hired 50 people before the entity was set up. Sometimes it's, you can't move fast enough, right? So, we get the call all the time where, and it's typically, a company that maybe doesn't have that international experience. Hey, we have, this great engineer, we've offered him a job. He's supposed to start next week. But we realize that, he wants to be employed full time. We don't have an entity in country. And now we're kind of stuck. And so we can help sort of get that right, make sure that they're compliantly hired, getting the local statutory benefits, that, all the employer contributions are being made. So that happens a lot. So if you've made that mistake or you've made that mistake, there are solutions, and we can, companies like GoGlobal can help you walk through those. And then obviously tapping into new talent. So as I said, not every opportunity is the same, and we've made EOR look really like the one choice, but this is really sort of situational. And so I'm going to walk through each of the scenarios here. Setting up an entity overseas definitely can help you mitigate things like tax compliance and staying compliant in country. It'll help you with a business model where you need to have a direct sort of revenue model. Obviously, by doing that, there's more means to protect your intellectual property. It's not necessarily the most cost-effective solution, particularly for low headcounts, because you have all that overhead that goes into setting up the entity and then maintaining it, right? So once you have it, you're going to have tax filings. In a lot of countries, you have things like audited financials. So there's an additional cost of maintaining that entity over time. And if you want to go fast, like you want to make the hire, in 10 days, the likelihood that you're going to be able to do that from sort of the jump under setting up your own entity is slim to none. The other is, sort of option might be looking at independent contractors. Independent contractors, really hard to mitigate compliance risk. You can build out contracts, but unless you sort of understand the local labor laws, if there is a complaint that comes up, you're going to be kind of in the deep end pretty quickly. And it's really difficult to have intellectual property protection, your IP, through the independent contractor model. So you can put contracts in place again, but harder to navigate when you don't have sort of the expertise or presence in a country. And then, obviously very cost effective. You're typically not having to make employer contributions. And so there's a means to do it, cost effectively and quickly. In EOR, the method itself helps mitigate the risk. So, we're employer records are making sure from an employment perspective, everything is being done compliant. All the contributions are being made. All the filings are being made. There's various means in terms of protecting the intellectual property. A company like GoGlobal, so this is an important distinction. In the 60 countries that we operate in, we have a legal entity, which gives more robust sort of ability to support, protecting intellectual property. And then there's means that we can put into employment contracts and things like that to make that more enforceable. It's more cost effective, obviously, than setting up your own entity, at least at a smaller headcount. So if you get into larger headcounts, it doesn't make as much economic sense, perhaps, and having your own entity might make more economic sense. And then obviously, our typical turnaround for hiring is 10 business days. So you can hire and bring on somebody really, really quick.
Okay, let's approach poll 4. So who are the key global expansion decision makers in this company? And you do have the option here to tick multiple boxes, because we've seen certainly evolution in the stakeholders involved in these key decisions. So it does run all the way from talent through to ops, through to finance, up to C-suite and across really. So I'm interested to see the results of this one. Give it a second. And please do specify if there's anyone else in your business that is touching upon these matters, whether it be procurement, engaging with service providers as well. Here we go. Okay, very widespread. Very widespread. So this does tie into our experiences of stakeholders we deal with, depending on the type of engagement we have, whether we are supporting companies hiring talent or just employing talent. Certainly on the hiring talent, we would tap into the talent acquisition managers, and on the product side, depending on who's hiring, whether it's a technology role or sales role or alike. And then certainly finance would always be, and legal involved, certainly in some aspects of the expansion chain to review costs and benefits of doing that as well. So I've seen some interesting questions in the chat, and I'm conscious of time, and I don't want to challenge these and cover these questions. So I will jump through the final slide, which is more around recruitment and hiring, and we'll leave some time at the end to tackle some questions which actually cover these points as well. So we've touched upon legacy options for expansion, legacy options for hiring staff in different countries. Certainly you can set up an entity and look to use that as a scenario to then hire your talent. If you want to bring talent into those entities where you have an entity so far, then you would use sponsored visas to bring that talent in, which can have its challenges. There can be quotas, time considerations, time constraints. And then obviously independent contractors and freelancers. Andrew touched upon the benefits of doing so and also the risks as well. And actually there has been a move towards individuals wanting to be permanently employed in countries, whether that be for getting a mortgage, getting loans, etc. That can have certain impacts on the individuals as well. And generally independent contractors can bear some risk depending on the type of roles they do. So it's important to do analysis on those individuals to look at the role they're doing, where they're under direction, supervision, and control, to make sure they are true contractors. And that's all the way from having the right paperwork to bank accounts. So we can skip on. Okay, so recruiting has been a very interesting trend over the last 3 or 4 years. And I would say the emergence of EOR has driven a very dynamic change in the decisions of companies in hiring staff, whereas traditionally they would look to hire within their local borders. Now, finding talent in your local borders is challenging. Finding talent outside of your borders is equally challenging, perhaps more so. And therefore, bridging into the expansion of remote work that we've seen over the last 3 years has given the impetus with the tools, the asynchronous tools, the ability to communicate online to hire individuals literally all around the world and engage with talent. And it's also driven individuals to look at their options of where they want to be based. And we've seen repatriation of staff from certain countries to other countries. Perhaps they want to move from one country back to their families, or there's other reasons to do so. So it's actually viewed as a potential perk for companies to retain talent as well as bring talent on, offer that flexibility. And we all see a lot of contact and communication on LinkedIn with that rise as well. And it's worth noting that although we're seeing layoffs in some economies and some talent pools, actually accessing the right talent at the right price still remains a tick box on many of the conversations we have. So whether that be in sales or technology roles or go-to-market roles, there's big trends. And actually, it's not just limited to those. We're seeing companies hiring accounting and finance talent, executive assistants, marketeers, designers, literally all around the world, because they can work in consistent pace. They can work when the headquarters is asleep. So it gets that pace of change and evolution. I think another thing we've seen is not that offshoring and onshoring is different or right or wrong, but there has been a slight trend away in companies offshoring based on some of the things that Andrew's mentioned before, looking after distribution centers as well, reterming it more of a nearshoring option, whereby companies are looking for individuals close to their borders. It could be a US company looking to hire customer service talent in Peru or Chile, or companies in Asia Pacific looking from Japan or China into some of the more emerging economies like Vietnam or Thailand, etc. as well. So communication, time zone, potential cost savings, but fundamentally the ability to find the right people for the right job. And we're seeing some really interesting trends in price. There's eco-social political ramifications. We're seeing changes in the ecosystems in these countries, more money is coming in as well. So it is a really interesting dynamic. And I noticed a question in the chat. So I think we can go on to the questions to finish the last 5 minutes, because there was one question around recruiting. So let's cap it there and jump into the questions. Martha, are you able to?
Yeah, while we're pulling up the questions, I think that our conclusion is, look, despite sort of some headwinds in the global economy, there's never been a better time to tap into the international workforce. Less restrictions, more opportunities. So higher where the talent is, higher where the market is. And even sort of looking at the global downturn as an opportunity, because certainly I think from a tech talent perspective, there's a lot more availability in the market.
Let's just quickly jump into our final poll question. So we'd love to hear from the audience. Are you interested in hearing more from GoGlobal about our recruiting and hiring services via employer records? So we can actually support companies hire all the way through to onboarding and potentially offboarding where necessary as well. So be interested to know whether that's a quick yes or no. And then we can jump into some questions. While we're waiting for the audience on that one, Martha, do we have any questions that you captured in the chat before we get the results of that?
Yeah, we do, Nick. I think you were speaking specifically about the hiring question, which is somebody was asking what are the best countries to source and hire tech talent right now outside of the US, because I think that's certainly a challenge for anybody who's recruiting right now.
Okay. Well, forgive me, this could be a whole nother webinar with HR.com, so I'll keep it brief. Depending on the type of roles, depending on the organization and what they're trying to achieve, we looked at analysis recently, whether you're hiring a full stack developer, 8 to 10 years experience, the gulf in the levels of cost is quite dramatic. So all the way from Poland through to Vietnam, Philippines, you can see differences from $20,000 annual cost all the way up to $70,000 in Poland. So it really depends on the type of individual, time zone, language skills, but it's dramatic. We've seen big trends of hiring in the Philippines. We're working on behalf of clients in Japan and China, hiring in the Philippines, a full range of software development roles as well. And we're also seeing pockets of other countries. There was an article we put out on LinkedIn, 14 top hubs for tech talent, and it goes all the way through to Vietnam, which is viewed as really the next Asian tiger. Kenya is a really interesting market. They're coining it the Silicon Savannah. There's phenomenal education and development of engineers there that are willing to work, happy to work, access to internet now with Starlink and other products that are enabling this continent to work as well. And all the way to the UAE, where I'm actually today in Dubai. So enabling individuals in countries that are encouraging engineers and talent to come here, work. So it's vast, Martha. And if the audience want any specific anecdotes or queries and questions, and I see you put in the chat a recent blog we did, I encourage you to read that and reach out if you want any more information.
Yeah, one of the other things, just one of the points that Nick just brought up is nearshoring. So we do see a lot of companies hiring in places like Mexico and Colombia. There's a greater density of tech talent there than probably in years past. And the ability to sort of manage, those teams, maybe with a core development team in the US, from a time zone perspective is much easier. If you're in a market overseas, there's an advantage to that as well, right? You could have that sort of 24-hour development. But if you're looking to sort of manage maybe a more junior team or something like that, then looking at nearshoring the talent gives some opportunity, and there's definitely more options available than there were in years past.
Okay. You guys, thanks so much. We're at the top of the hour, and I think we need to turn it back over to HR.com now. But before we do that, I want to, Andrew, you could definitely keep talking. I know. I'd love to thank everybody who joined us and Go Global today for this webcast. HR.com, back over to you.
I'd like to thank our presenters as well as all of you for joining us today. If you'd like to view this webcast again, the archive recording will be available on the HR.com website within 24 hours. Your feedback is important to us. Please take a moment to fill out the exit survey that opened in a new browser page on your computer. This concludes our webcast. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.